After being in this industry over 20 years, I've noticed a few things. Specifically, how investors fail time and again to address the biggest enemy that threatens the potential success of your financial future. We call this investor insanity. In this episode, I will expose what that enemy is, the danger it represents, and most importantly, the steps you need to take to defeat it. The insanity begins in 30 seconds.
Welcome to Financial Insanity, the podcast that explores potential pitfalls facing old world financial concepts and introduces updated options designed to help investors thrive in the new economy. Join host Jason Vino with each episode as he discusses new ways for new days to enhance your finance and finally stop the insanity.
Welcome to episode 2 of Financial Insanity. I am your tour guide, host, line leader, and fellow investor, Jason Vino. In October 1819, Daniel Sickles was born into a wealthy family in New York City. He would later become an American politician, soldier, and diplomat. However, throughout his life, Mr. Sickles was involved in a number of scandals, the most notable of which was the murder of his wife's lover, Philip Barton Key. Now, Philip Barton Key was a U.S. attorney and also the son of Francis Scott Key, the guy who wrote our national anthem, the Star-Spangled Banner. So Daniel Sickles gunned down the son of the man who wrote our national anthem, and he did it in broad daylight in front of witnesses. And get this, directly across the street from the White House in Washington, D.C. Now, based on this, you might think that Mr. Daniel Sickles would most definitely be spending the rest of his life staring at the inside of a jail cell, but you would be wrong, because Mr. Sickles was acquitted of this crime and set completely free. The reason behind this outcome ties in very well to the enemy that you face as an investor, which I will explain in detail a little later in this episode. But first, we need to take a step back to uncover some supporting facts and evidence for our case today. You will soon learn that a foundation of financial insanity focuses on how changes over time have affected our lives. If you think back to the old world and how things used to be, you'll start to realize how the addition of new options over time has complicated the decision-making process. I remember when I was young, I basically had 4 TV channels to choose from. There was NBC, CBS, ABC, or KET. That was it. Now, with cable and satellite, there are literally thousands of channels to pick from. You have the Travel Channel, the Food Channel, Home and Garden, Do It Yourself, the Golf Channel, football, tennis, hockey, boxing, skiing, home shopping, celebrity shopping. Whatever you can think of probably has a channel about it. Even items as simple as coffee have changed over time. Back when things were simple, our choices in coffee were deciding between light, medium, or dark roast. Now you can go to Starbucks and you can order a tall, half-calf, skinny, no-foam latte with soy milk, 2 pumps of vanilla, caramel drizzle at 120 degrees. I recently saw that Starbucks Chief Marketing Officer Sharon Rothstein claimed that the company now offers over 80,000 different drink combinations. That is a lot of decisions to be made. It's been reported that the average adult makes about 35,000 decisions every single day, which works out to be one decision every 2.5 seconds. We have to decide what to eat, what to wear, what are we going to buy, what are we going to say, what are we going to think, what are we going to believe, how will we vote, who will we date, who are we going to marry, and then we have kids, and then we have to start deciding what they're going to eat, what they're going to wear, and what they're going to do. And every choice or decision that we make leads to a specific outcome that can be either good or bad. The decisions that you have to make are more complicated than ever in the investment world as well. The financial industry has continually to introduce new options all the time that help further confuse your decisions when it comes to ways to invest, who to listen to, and what approach to use. For example, you have to determine if you would rather go it alone or team up with someone that can help you make the financial decisions throughout your life. If you decide to team up with someone, should you use a consultant, a planner, an advisor, an investment guy, insurance person, or a banker? Is it then better to work with somebody that is independent or works for a company? Then what about investing? You need to decide, should you use mutual funds, stocks, bonds, cash, or annuities? And then determine the specifics within each of these categories. For instance, if you like mutual funds, you got to decide, are you going to use traditional funds, index funds, exchange traded funds, leverage funds, or target funds? If you're considering bonds or you like bonds, you have to understand that not all bonds are created equal. You have corporate bonds, high yield bonds, investment bonds, treasury bonds, government, municipal, and foreign bonds. Then, once you have determined which investments you're going to own, now you have to figure out, how are you going to manage them? What approach should you use? Should you use an adaptive approach, a managed approach, passive, or something else? So you can start to see how easily you can become confused. And as you will learn shortly, this confusion has the power to impair your brain's ability to make a logical and rational decision, which determines the potential success or failure of your financial future. But having the ability to make our own decisions is an incredible thing. It gives us the power to control our actions. And these actions have a direct impact on our results. And these results will determine our future potential. So knowing this, it would make sense to first understand, how do we make decisions now? And then what are some ways that we can improve this process? So ask yourself, how do you make decisions? A few years ago, a neuroscientist named Antonio Damasio made a groundbreaking discovery. He studied people who had damage in the part of the brain where their emotions are generated. He found that they seemed normal, except that they were not able to feel emotions. But they all had one thing in common. They couldn't make decisions. They could describe what they thought they should be doing in logical terms, yet they found it very difficult to even make the simplest of decisions, such as what to eat. Without being able to weigh out the pros and cons from an emotional standpoint, these test subjects were unable to arrive at a decision. So even though that we feel that we are logical beings, the reality is that emotion plays into every single decision that we make. Studies have shown that the higher the stakes and the more complicated the decision, the more influence that emotion plays in our decisions. The more you study and learn about the brain, the more you realize how truly amazing it is, and how specific parts of the brain, your brain, influence your thoughts and your actions in different ways. You've probably heard of someone described as either left-brained or right-brained. Left brain refers to someone who is more analytical and methodical, while right brain describes someone who tends to be more creative or artistic. The front of our brain is known as the frontal lobe. And within this frontal lobe houses what is called the prefrontal cortex. This is the part of our brain that is designed to calculate risk and reward, to solve problems and make decisions from a logical standpoint. Now, researchers have long studied this prefrontal cortex in many different ways. One particular study I found most interesting was done by the University of Pittsburgh recently, which was set up to determine what effects the addition of anxiety and or stress may have on our logical thinking within this prefrontal cortex. They discovered when anxiety is included as a part of the decision-making process, that the brain neurons most needed to make logical decisions become damaged and disruptive. The research showed anxiety caused the brain cells specific to problem solving and critical thinking to disengage. And this resulted in test subjects making bad decisions and poor choices. Interestingly enough, they also discovered the same test subjects displayed a change in behavior and also had a decreased ability to control their emotions. The more anxiety there was, the more emotions influenced the decision. Research has shown that when you feel excited, then you have a tendency to overestimate your chances of success and underestimate associated risk. You feel almost invincible, a little greedy, You'll take risks you wouldn't normally take because you think everything's going to be fine. Fear, on the other hand, does many strange things to the decision-making process. It encourages retreat. It impedes progress. It eliminates tolerance for risk and for change. Fear basically freezes our thoughts. We are unable to see logical solutions, and we often try to avoid a decision altogether. Mr. Gregory Burns is an American neuroscientist, psychologist, author, and professor of psychiatry and behavioral sciences at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia. A while back, he performed a study to research and understand how different conditions might affect human brain patterns. Participants were placed inside of an MRI scanner, and they had electrodes that were attached to the top of their feet to deliver little shocks. These shocks were just unpleasant enough so that the individuals would prefer to avoid them, but not too much to where they were unbearably painful. They were told at the beginning of each trial that the shock would vary between being either large or small, and it would occur between 1 to 30 seconds after hearing a bell. Once completed, the study produced some very interesting developments as it concluded the wait period had more of an effect on the brain than the shock itself. In fact, the longer the wait period, the more anxiety and damage the brain experienced. When the participants were given a choice, they actually chose to have a bigger shock with a shorter wait time rather than having to wait an extended period of time in exchange for a smaller shock. The anticipation was worse than the pain itself. It was concluded that although illogical, the brain exerted the most amount of energy in the face of fear and had the highest levels of anxiety just by the anticipation of pain or loss. And, listen to this, they found that as fear increased, the exploratory part of the brain, the part that opens itself up to allow risk and outside ideas, began to completely shut down, causing the brain to jam up, which then led to bad judgment and eventually a complete inability to make rational decisions. So if we apply this to investing, even if the market is not actually in the midst of an economic downfall, the emotions will convince you to do the wrong thing at the wrong time and convince us that we need to find a flight to safety, to jump ship, and to abort by all means possible. Now you might be sitting there thinking, why are you spending so much time on this, Jason? What's the point? It's just so important to first present the evidence and the foundation so that you understand the why behind the what, and specifically why you do what you do when you do what you do, why you think the way you think, and how outside conditions can affect your decisions, which influence your actions, which then impact your results. So if anticipation alone has the potential to have a significant impact on your decisions and your actions, then it would probably be good to understand what exactly leads to these assumptions in the first place. And the answer to that is your beliefs. We entered into this world with a clean slate. We had no preconceived beliefs whatsoever. Then as we experience life, we begin to form certain thoughts and ideas that become embedded within our brain over time. Most of these beliefs are formed during our childhood through experiences and observations, or by accepting what others tell us to be true. They then guide us throughout our lives and affect how we think, act, respond, and feel. They impact our decisions, our actions, and how we handle situations. For instance, when we were young, our parents told us that before we could cross the street, we must look both ways. We would always automatically accept this to be true, and then we have carried this idea throughout our entire lives, which has now become an automatic response for any time that we cross the street. If we had a bad experience with a neighbor's dog when we were young, or maybe your parents told you that dogs were dangerous, you would probably do everything possible to avoid contact with dogs. You might even begin to notice that what you perceive to be a dog's growl, or maybe even a look of anger, and then you collect this as evidence to further support the belief that you have that dogs are in fact dangerous. On the opposite side, you might completely fail to even notice when a friendly dog comes up wagging its tail and approaches you in a very playful manner, because this goes against what your inner belief is. Our experiences can cause us to view the world through a filtered lens. Throughout our lives, our minds are constantly seeking out evidence in attempts to validate our ideas and to reject anything that might challenge them. Studies have even shown when data or evidence comes along and begins to challenge our ideas, there is actually a physical resistance against the brain's neural pathways that hold these thoughts. Just ask a conspiracy theorist to back up their claims, and they can almost always come up with data needed to support what they believe. However, should you present facts that counteract these beliefs, they will be very quick to reject it as false because it goes against their theory. A great example of this is a crazy rumor that has persisted over 50 years that claims Paul McCartney of the Beatles got into a vicious argument with his bandmates in the studio one afternoon in 1966. He ran out the door and went speeding off in his car, which ended in a horrible crash that ultimately ended his life. And unknown to the general public, he was secretly replaced with a look-alike imposter named Billy Shears. The rumor became so widespread that Life magazine referred to it on their 1969 cover, and it boasted the title, "Paul is Still With Us." There have been books and articles written about this over the years, and many people who still believe it to be true. These people are quick to point out secret clues that they claim to exist within the artwork of Beatles album covers and hidden messages that appear when playing the records backwards. We all carry our own biases based on what we believe to be true and what our brain focuses on. And it will focus on information to back up our thoughts and ideas. Have you ever noticed when you buy a new car, you drive off and hit the open highway, and suddenly you start to notice that same car is everywhere, and you hadn't really noticed that before? What about when you first started either wanting a child or had a baby? Remember how suddenly you started to notice that babies were everywhere? Or maybe there was a time that you had a breakup. You turn on the radio, and every song you hear seems to be written about love. This occurs because our brains seek out what we are familiar with or what is important to us. And it's constantly searching for data and evidence to support these thoughts that we hold near and dear. Now, the truth is, our brains are inherently lazy. We're all creatures of habit because our minds actually prefer to just fill in a blank with a belief and then move along and hold on to these ideas for as long as possible. It's like the bouncer at the local club. He stands at the doorway with a big line, but he won't let anybody in because he just prefers to let the people who are inside stay inside as long as possible. Then every once in a while, on a rare occasion, he might be open to letting someone in, but he has a rule that says one person must leave before a new one enters. This is very similar to how your mind works. It wants to hold on to what you've already learned or experienced or believe. And the longer that you hold on to this, the more embedded into your subconscious it becomes. This is why we always tend to gravitate back to our normal behaviors when we try to implement a change. Like when we go on a diet or we take up physical activity. Our brain is constantly trying to pull us back to what it is used to and what it feels comfortable with. So the problem with all this is that your experiences and your beliefs can slant your view of reality. It can change the way that you look at things and cause you to miss opportunities because it does not align with what you have carried with you for so long. We live in a world that has constant change, and things around you change all the time, but our minds don't want to change with it. So we get stuck holding on to beliefs and ideas based on past experiences that may cause us to take the wrong action or make the wrong decision going forward into the future. So here's the deal. You were probably taught at some point in your life that investing, at least from a logical standpoint, sounds easy. It's just two basic rules: buy low and sell high. Protect during the bad times and grow during the good. But if you have any experience at all with the stock market, you know that this is much easier than it sounds. Because at some point, you have to make some decisions concerning when to buy, when to sell, what strategy to use, whose advice to rely on. Decisions that have all the components we've been talking about that can increase anxiety, which brings out emotions, which, as we have learned, has the ability to impair your judgment and challenge your logic, which then can potentially cause you to make a bad decision. And bad decisions can ultimately lead to bad results. This is the process that causes so many investors to repeat the same cycle and make the same mistakes, which leads to the same results and then creates the same anticipation of fear, which brings out the same emotions that then produce the same actions over and over, and on it goes. But there is one more factor that we have not yet discussed. Have you ever known somebody who was in a relationship and they just never seem happy? They're always complaining, talking about the person they're with doesn't treat them right, just not a good fit. Or what about somebody who has a job that just always seems to be bringing them down? They say it's not what they plan on doing the rest of their life. They don't like the people they work with. They don't like the job they have or what they're doing. They're just not fulfilled in any way. And yet people in these situations so often continue to stay in the situation even though they're not happy. Well, why is that? Well, the reality is that we as humans are often more fearful of the unknown than we are of staying in something that we already know and feels comfortable to us, even if we don't really like it. This fear of the unknown is the hardest thing for investors to accept and the number one obstacle that often holds them back, not knowing what will happen in the future or how it may affect you. When we have something unknown like this, we begin to fill in our own blanks because we have nothing concrete to help support or frame our decisions. So as we've talked about, when there's less information to rely on, then our logic starts to decrease and the emotions start to take over. We assume if it feels good, then it must be right. And if it feels uncomfortable, it must be wrong. This is what most often causes majority of investors to continually do the wrong thing at the wrong time, becoming overly emotional with fear or greed, which physically, psychologically, and mentally impairs the logical process within your brain and alters your decision-making ability. Let's wrap this up by ending where we started and bring back Mr. Daniel Sickles. If you remember, Mr. Sickles was arrested for murdering the son of Francis Scott Key, who he gunned down in the front of the White House with witnesses present. Mr. Sickles, after going through trial, was acquitted and was set completely free. And the reason for this is because Mr. Daniel Sickles is known as the first person in the United States of America to successfully use the legal plea of temporary insanity. And based on this, was found not guilty of his crime. Now, the definition of temporary insanity is that it is a mental impairment that results from a psychological trauma that produces the inability to control your actions or even understand that the action you're doing may be wrong at the time it was carried out. So basically, you've lost it. Your emotions have taken total control over your body and your mind. You don't know up from down or right from wrong. You were sane one minute, and the next minute you were not. Now, the interesting thing is that research has shown during extreme measures of the market, you as an investor can inhibit the same traits associated with temporary insanity. When the market is making new highs like it did in 2000, 2007, and again in 2017, people suddenly possess what's called investor amnesia, and they seem to forget that the market can also go down and become overconfident. And they throw caution to the wind, let the chips fall where they may, and they're not worried about risk anymore. They have what we call irrational exuberance. And then, when things take a turn, as they always do, they act surprised. And suddenly, thoughts of what happened previously in the market downfalls comes back to them. And their conditioned belief creates their conditioned response, and the fear sets in, and suddenly the irrational exuberance is gone. Now the investor is frozen with fear. When these things happen and the market is at extremes, you as the investor throw logic out the window and give in 100% to emotion, and you become temporarily insane. You do things you would not normally do under a rational situation. Your actions go completely against what your logic has told you for so long. Buy low, sell high. You do the opposite, and it happens time and time again. So at some point you have to learn How do you stop this insanity? How to put on the brakes so the cycle does not continue to repeat itself for the rest of your life. So in case you haven't figured it out by now, the number one enemy that you face as an investor when it comes to investing and being successful over the long term is your emotions. It's that man or a woman that you look at in the mirror. If you understand this and you can learn how to control your emotions and use them to your favor, then you will possess one of the most important keys to enhancing your current path to financial success by implementing small changes now that can lead to a giant impact later on. And in part 2 of this episode, I will tell you exactly what those steps are. I'll leave you today with a great quote that says, "You should never make a permanent decision based on a temporary emotion." See you next time.
Want more financial insanity? Need to contact us or ask a question? Great. First, subscribe and review us on iTunes. Then head over to financialinsanity.com to join our community, download additional episodes, and access articles. Thanks for listening to this episode, and be sure to join us next time as we teach more ways to enhance your finance and stop the insanity.
Advisory services offered through Enhance Wealth, a member of Advisory Services Network, LLC.